This is going to be a presentation on TwoSpirit Dry for autistic well-being. I'll define some of these terms for you. First, I would like to acknowledge that I'm doing this work on the unceded ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Kwikwetlem First Nations. I also would like to acknowledge the Stolo First Nations, which I had the privilege of being raised with their culture when I was young. So a little bit about me. For 10 years, I was a graphic novelist. What does that have to do with this? A lot, it turns out, because in my work as an indie artist, I interfaced with a population that was mostly autistic or otherwise neurodiverse with ADHD, mostly trans, and experiencing a whole lot of iatrogenic or medical-based harm and barriers to care access. I kind of bridged through being a biomedical illustrator and eventually landed here in public health so that I could serve this population. They supported me for a decade. I'm a member of the TwoSpirit Dry Lab, as we said, TwoSpirit Turtle Island's first research group devoted to Two-Spirit people, and also Reaffirm Collaborative, which focuses on environments that affirm Two-Spirit LGBTQ well-being. So first, what is Two-Spirit? And we have this great chart from CIHR, and these slides will be available to you because I'm not going to read all of this. What I really want to connect with you about in terms of this is that Two-Spirit is a term that was new. We coined it in the 90s, used to describe queer, lesbian, gender and sexual diverse Indigenous peoples to reflect historical identities that are different from nation to nation. So it's an umbrella term for all of these identities, but it will mean different things to different nations, and it is for Indigenous people. And then what is autism? So autism and other neurodiversity, I'm also going to talk a little bit about ADHD, are neurobiological differences. I'm going to say differences and not deficits, because that is how it is often framed. So in Canada, the only federally funded therapies we have for autism, which, and this is something I know as someone who's on the spectrum and who has children on the spectrum, is applied behavioral analysis. The idea of applied behavioral analysis, which was developed in conjunction with conversion therapy, is to take behaviors which are non-normative and make them behaviors that are normative. So one of the reasons I find this concept challenging is we now have studies that show, which I'm going to draw your attention to this, that autistic people and other neurodiverse people can actually interact with each other and transmit information in a peer-to-peer way just as successfully as allistic or non-autistic people. And the information transfer only gets interrupted when you introduce someone from one group to the other. So when we look at the DSM categorization as a social deficit, well, we kind of have to question that. Is it a social deficit or is it a social difference? So now I'm going to talk about the unicorn study. This was the Understanding, Affirming Communities, Relationships and Network study, which was done for youth 15 to 29. One of the questions on this study was around neurodiversity. We also had a large amount of Indigenous respondents. So in the entire study, we had over 4,000. That was our goal. 881 of those were Indigenous, 159 of those were Two-Spirit. So I was interested in looking at what was going on with that Two-Spirit population. So in this Two-Spirit population, 78% of them identified as neurodiverse, which I thought was astounding. So I've broken down just with autism and ADHD. So this green bar is how many of them identified with ADHD. This blue bar is how many identified as having autism. And then this purple bar is how many had both autism and ADHD. So as you can see, that's quite a significant population, proportion of this population. Specifically, we have 28% with ADHD compared to just 2.9% of Canadians who self-identify. So we're looking at self-identification in both of these. 21% reporting autism, 1 to 2% of Canadian children have a diagnosis. So we're looking at a little bit of a different standard there, but it's an enormous difference. So what we're seeing is that there is this enormous overlap. And what I'm interested in is what that overlap can teach us, because when we look at how Two-Spirit is framed, we're looking at how people who are sexual and gender diverse have a role in their society, have a place. Their difference is not stigmatized, it is accepted and supported and celebrated. So I'm interested in learning with Two-Spirit Seeing. This is a play on Albert Marshall's Two-Eyed Seeing, where we are valuing colonial science and we're also upholding Indigenous wisdom. And I want to apply Two-Spirit Seeing to the neurodiverse population so that we can see how these supports can be built and move away from this Western deficit-based model. And so a part of that is that I looked at this question we asked in Unicorn, which was, we would like to hear about a time when your sexuality or gender identity was appreciated, celebrated, or even acknowledged. And so when I look at these stories, and these are wonderful stories, I encourage you to come back and read them. I'm gonna go back to the slide. Something that came up was these themes of family, these themes of social support. Again, I was only looking at the answers from neurodiverse people, but there are these repetitive themes of family, support, friends, not this like isolated picture of autism we would expect. So to highlight the differences between how we see autism in a colonial context and how we see autism in an Indigenous context is that autism in a colonial context is again defined by persistent social deficits. Those deficits might be missed if you're in a community that is also autistic, and autistic people are really great at finding each other. Lack of eye contact, difficulties adjusting, it's all these sort of social based deficits, fixated interests, which again, is this a deficit? Is this something different? And so their solution is to change behaviors to enforce social norms. I do want to address, because we're talking about 2-8 seeing, that there are comorbid disorders with autism, things like Ehlers-Danlos, things like postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, that I'm not going to throw out of like medicalizing autism, because these are things we must acknowledge in this population and also treat. However, when we want to look at the Indigenous side of autism, we look at the Cree word, pito taitan, one who thinks differently. Different in this context, I really want to highlight, because in Indigenous culture, we celebrate differences is not pejorative. Again, celebrated, not pathologized. And so the colonial solution in creating normative behaviors and changing a person to suit society is no longer appropriate. So the problem is the stigma being experienced by these people and the lack of access to health care, often driven by that stigma, especially in a population where we have indigeneity and autism and sexual or gender diversity. So kind of the model I'm working right now using an Indigenous storytelling based method is this idea of nocturnal pollinators, is seeing autism, we're misunderstood, we're misrepresented. We simply need a change of environment to thrive. Often we're using communication methods that might look a little different. If you give a bat sunglasses, that's not going to enable it to communicate with a bird. And so, however, I'm one person. And so what I'm interested in doing is using arts-based methods. I first encountered this, the Amplify project run by Brittany Bingham, to see what other Two-Spirit and autistic or ADHD people, how they are perceiving themselves. And because people with autism and ADHD often struggle with verbal methods, I'm interested in using arts-based methods in order to gain that from them. And as a way to bring together this group and encourage them to talk about their art piece. I think that's where the magic happens as well, when you have something separate from yourself to talk about, to learn what wisdom we have so that we can inform care pathways moving forward for this really underserved population, especially in terms of mental health needs and in terms of strengths that already exist in the community and can be used as resources. So is another reason for arts-based approaches is because in Indigenous methodology, we are looking to find ways around these like colonial structures. I would like to offer them the opportunity to ask for what they would like researched. I am just one person. I cannot represent this entire population, even though I am part of it. And so arts-based research is an opportunity for this population to essentially tell us what they need and what they don't need. So I think I went really fast. But miigwech, merci, thank you so much for your time and listening about this population. Here are my works.